Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the History Value podcast with our frequent guest, Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're going to be talking about the Interpolations. Yes, I had to pronounce that just a little bit different because he put Paul in the middle there, which I thought was just hilariously clever. One of the things he brings up in this text is Galatians 1:18 to 19. When he talked about James being the Lord's brother. And he also talks about that Tertullian did
I'm
not...
wrong about that, by the way. It's Irenaeus. Sorry about that.
Oh, Irenaeus? Yeah. No problem. Irenaeus, not mentioning the Lord's brother. He says here, unless the allusion is interpolated, Paul had an interview with a brother of Jesus who was one of the three pillars of the Church of Jerusalem, Galatians 1:19. There is a critical case of some slight cogency against the authenticity of Galatians 1:18 to 19, which was absent from Marcion's Apostolicon. The word again in Galatians 2:1, which presupposes the earlier passage, seems to have been interpolated as it is absent from Irenaeus' full and accurate citation of this section of the epistle to the Galatians in his treatise against heretics. So in that argument, which I think is very solid, why does Professor Bart Ehrman, in your opinion, defend its authenticity in spite of Irenaeus not having it in his copy?
Well, as I remember, I brought this up. This is a quote. I forget offhand who I'm quoting, but it isn't my suggestion. It's important to my argument that this was the suggestion of a non-mythicist, and I'm simply quoting that whole passage. And my point was, Bart says that that mythicists love interpolation arguments or create them because they realize certain passages are inimical to their idea that Paul didn't think Jesus was a historical figure, but only a celestial one. So he says that we suggest, this is what somebody called surgical exegesis, that you don't like a particular passage, so you say, yeah, it must have been an interpolation. It wasn't in the original. But I show how, about 8 of these things were not put forth by mythicists. They were suggestions of people that had no interest in mythicism, as far as we know, and weren't talking about it in the context where they mentioned these things. Mythicists are simply saying, wow, isn't that interesting? Some people have suggested these passages without our agenda. Were interpolations, and so we're going with it. Of course, you can't prove it, but you can't prove that in this case the word again was there, and it does kind of imply that if Irenaeus is quoting the whole passage accurately, otherwise, but does not have the crucial word that his copy didn't have it. And it would also imply that since the word again makes that a second, the visit where they're debating circumcision, that would mean in Irenaeus's copy, this was the only visit of Jerusalem by Paul, and the one earlier it wasn't there, so because you had to only put again if you're trying to distinguish between 2 visits, but without the word again, the Greek, of course, you've got this as the visit, and this is not the one with James. So it's pretty good. I mean, in a time when we don't have any manuscripts as old as Irenaeus, you can, I think, validly infer that his copy was shorter than ours at various points and didn't have this, and that it's an anti-Marcionite interpolation. So I think it's pretty good, but as I remember, Bart just didn't respond to it. He just seems to, well, he's a textual critic first and foremost. The historical Jesus thing is not his original field of interest as a New Testament scholar, and he trained under Bruce Metzger, who was, well, I hesitate to say it, but almost a fundamentalist. And he wasn't any kind of fighting fundy, as they used to say. He wasn't some kind of nut, but he had very conservative views. And so did Bart at the time. But eventually he decided he couldn't go that route. But he seems to maintain a lot of the baggage from that period. And of course, there is also a vested interest, and I don't mean to say trumped up or fake or anything like a government spokesman spinning stuff. I don't mean that, but he these textual critics have a kind of they work on the assumption that we do have the text as it stood originally, at least 90+%. And so they in fact, Frederick Vissa and I believe Jerome Murphy O'Connor, one Protestant, one Catholic, both argue that, look, if we start taking seriously interpolation theories, you can't play the game anymore. You don't really know what was originally said. And Bart, I think, is going on that basis. He doesn't want to give up what he thinks is the certainty, though it's ironic. In another connection, he does undermine the textual integrity of the New Testament in Greek. He says that there are, what, hundreds or thousands of textual variants, and that this means we don't know for sure what the heck was originally in there, but he treats it as if we do, basically. In his book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, he's dealing with a later period where he says things, a few things here and there sprinkled throughout, look like they were changed by means of redaction criticism, that Orthodox Catholic writers were trying to yank the rug out from under heretics, the way they interpreted certain passages. So, well, let's prevent that by rewriting them slightly. So it's funny that where there is evidence, because there are texts, he is quite suspicious and infers backward to the earlier period from which we have no texts, that it could have been open season, and we can't know what it said for sure. But in practice, he just scoffs at that once it comes up to saying that, oh, maybe these apparent historical Jesus references in Paul were not integral. Now, wait just a minute. He draws the line in the sand there, and I don't know why, except that he wants to play the game most of the time.
Yeah, that does sound strange. And when I get to the part of the article, when you talk about 1 Corinthians 15, you said here, I have made a case that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-11 was interpolated into its present context, but then I don't count since I'm a crazy mythicist, but others not mythicists have beaten me to the punch. Winston Monroe suspects 1 Corinthians 15, 1-11 of belonging to a subsequent post-Pauline stratum of the epistle, while J.C. O'Neill also deems it most probable that 1 Corinthians 15, 1-11 is a later creedal summary not written by Paul. R. Joseph Hossman speaks of the interpolative character of 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8. Bart does not linger to examine any of the individual interpolation proposals he scorns. He simply decrees that no literary argument are sufficient to trump the lack of manuscript evidence. What I'm curious about here is when J.C. O'Neill pointed out that it's a later creedal summary.
Hmm.
What makes it, like, so the audience can understand, could you describe why one would think that it's a creedal summary?
And most scholars do think that, even if they think Paul is quoting an early creed handed on to him.
Yeah.
And the reason is partly that it has a kind of poetic meter. It isn't just plain old prose, and that the various clauses of it are introduced with that. I've delivered as of first importance to you what was delivered to me, that Jesus died for our sins in accordance with Scripture, that he was crucified, dead, and buried, that he appeared to so and so, and then he appeared to this one, and then he appeared to that one, and then he appeared to that one. It's almost a threefold formula, and if that's the case, then that has another interesting implication. A creed is not evidence for a belief. A creed embodies the belief for which one might seek evidence. And that strikes me as amazing, that anybody who appeals to this, as they all do, as the earliest resurrection material, that they don't seem to realize the genre of what they're looking at. It's like taking the Apostles' Creed as evidence for the truth of Christianity. It's not that. It's not supposed to be that. It's just saying, yeah, here's what we believe, hallelujah. And so I don't, it's very strange to me that they treat it as if Paul is Perry Mason in a courtroom, feeding, Exhibit A, Your Honor, he appeared to Cephas. It's just not that. They're reading their bias, their agenda into it. It's exactly like the crazy argument one hears even more often, that the gospel tradition of the sayings and deeds of Jesus must be authentic because the apostles would have clamped the lid on any phony ones, any secondary ones, saying, wait a minute, brother, I was with Jesus. I don't remember him ever saying anything about Oldsmobiles, and steal a Woody Allen joke. It's like, what do they think the apostles were? Did Jesus commission them to say, go into all creation, stifling and stultifying false rumors about what I said? No. They're just pretending the apostles, whoever they were apologists like them. It's grossly silly. And then one last thing about this, they say Christians, the evidence is that Christians clearly distinguished between their views and those of Jesus. And they always quote this thing in 1 Corinthians, I say, and not I, but the Lord, that something about divorce and so on. They say, you see, he would say, and then in another place he says, now this I'm saying on my own. I don't have a word from the Lord on this, but I think you can trust me. Well, that doesn't that mean? He said, well, okay, I'm second class, but that's not bad. Jesus, trust me, you should too. He, in the same letter, it says elsewhere, if anybody thinks he's a prophet, he ought to be able to discern that what I am writing you is a word from the Lord. I don't know how you can say, oh no, he must be quoting the Q document or something. No, he doesn't say that. He says, I don't happen to have a revelation from the heavenly hotline, the royal telephone, as the old chorus says. Oh no, but I'm a wise, trusted apostle, so you can take it from me. Well, even if he was talking about a revelation from Jesus or a quote from a historical Jesus, that is vastly overwhelmed, smothered by the plain evidence of the Gnostic texts, where their Jesus can't shut up. He's talking about the various levels of heaven and what you have to know to make it past the checkpoints and all kinds of stuff. Well, why do they not take that into account? I mean, that is freewheeling Jesus fabrication. Well, they say, oh, well, those folks weren't really early Christians. It's like when fundamentalists say, well, Catholics are not Christians. What the hell are you talking about? And it's the same thing. Sorry to get so upset.
Oh no, no, it's all good. Here's something else he said in this text. Galatians 4:4. I conclude that verses 4 and 5 originally comprise a short creedal affirmation in poetic form. It is possible that Paul himself quoted a Jewish Christian hymn to illustrate his point that the coming of God's Son meant adoption as God's sons for men, but I hesitate to believe that Paul was responsible, because I should have expected Paul to make some reference to the fact that what applied to Jews who were under the law applied also to the Gentiles who were not.
Yeah, that's J.C. O'Neill. Yeah. Sometimes his argument is that this doesn't seem to fit what you read elsewhere. Another great example of that would be O'Neill's commentary on Romans, where he says the first chapter or so has to be an interpolated text from a Hellenistic or the diaspora Judaism synagogue sermon, because it has nothing to do with being justified by grace through faith. It just says that, hey, fellow Jews, let's not smear the Gentiles, because, yeah, admittedly, they're into all kinds of weird stuff because of idolatry, and their gods are rapists and all. Yeah, that's a problem. But who would deny that there are righteous Gentiles who don't have the Torah, never heard of the Torah, but have the commandments of God written on their hearts? He says, now, if they are righteous and you with your Torah are not, who's God going to accept? And then there's the redactional addition, on the day when the secrets of men's hearts are judged by Jesus and all that. It has nothing to do with the rest of the epistle, which is all about how you need the death of Christ. Here, no, has nothing to do with it. So it's not that there are known manuscripts that don't have this, but because again, there are no manuscripts early enough. But O'Neill says, I don't see, unless Paul is a schizophrenic, unless he's a multiple personality case, how could he have written both of these? And if this is another one of those, he says, how would Paul have been able to resist the opportunity to say Jews, Gentiles alike all become sons of God? That one's a little less strong than the one in Romans, but it's the same type of argument, and it is reasonable, though the mythicist thing doesn't depend on it one way or the other.
Right. And the thing is, like we talked about before, second century Christians are already saying that James was the son of Theudas.
Yeah, that's really striking.
Yeah.
Boy, how could you get that wrong? If I mean, the more popular one, you can see where that came from, to tie James and the sect for whom he served as a figurehead. You can see how they would want to bring him closer to Jesus, just like Luke did with John the Baptist. Oh, did you know John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin? Yeah. So you guys really belong with us. It seems transparent to me that when the second century church tied James to Jesus, it was the same sort of maneuver.
Yeah. Why do you think that the brother of the Lord was added into Galatians?
Well, just for that reason, to say that that it was well, in fact, it's and Bart chuckled at this one too. In the Old Testament, especially in Genesis, we have loads of cases of what Gunkel called genealogical legends. where if we want to, if we in Israel are making some kind of alliance with the Ishmaelite tribes, the way to do it is to say, you know, we come from a common ancestor. We're both the sons of Abraham. And there's loads of those. Israel is related to the Ammonites and the Moabites, even though we don't like them, but we can't deny that we're kin. So what do? We say, well, both those guys, their progenitors were the sons of Lot, who was not Abraham's son, because they don't want to bring him too close, but Abraham's nephew. So yeah, there's an undeniable connection, but that's like, as Lovecraft would say, the decayed branch of the family. And it's the same sort of thing to seal alliances. You would say we had ancestors in common, so we're blood brothers. And I think it's the same thing, though of course not ethnically this time, but it's like John the Baptist. You want to co-opt and absorb the John the Baptist sect. So you say, well, you know, you're really a branch of the family. John was Jesus' cousin. And in the same way here, you Essenes out there who venerate James the Just, good, but you really ought to be with us because he was Jesus' cousin and therefore brother, and therefore, you know, real both chips off the old block. So it seems transparent to me. This is a long tradition of genealogical myths for the same reason, just like in what is it, First Maccabees. Suddenly it turns out that, what do you know, Jews and Spartans are relatives way back.
Yeah.
What? Well, it came in handy because they're trying to make a military alliance. So they're forging this link, and I do mean forge. And I just think that's what happened in the case of this.
It reminds me of a statement, I think it's in Herodotus, where he was talking about that too, about the Spartans are of the seed of Abraham. Although I could be confusing it with another text. It might have only been in First Maccabees, but yeah, I remember reading something like that in an ancient text.
Oh, people, it just seems crazy, but it's not. That's crazy like a fox when you realize, I mean, it's explicit in First Maccabees that this is an instrument to forge an alliance. Otherwise, you know, why should they care what happens to us? We're related though, so you don't want to leave your brethren in the lurch, do you? It's so fascinating, this kind of thing. I like to quote Henry Frankenstein from the Universal Frankenstein movie. He said, have you never wondered what causes the sun to shine or the grass to grow? If you talk like that, people call you crazy. Yeah, I know. I'm used to being called crazy. But I don't care. I mean, anybody that's ever broken with the regnant paradigm is called crazy, no matter how cogent their arguments may be. Like the guy that discovered continental drift, they wrote him off as another Velikovsky until they realized, oops, tectonic plates. I guess he was right. Or like today, right? Where'd the COVID-19 virus come from? Oh, I think it was cooked up in a lab in China. Oh, you're crazy. We're cutting off your Twitter account, and now everybody says, yeah, I guess it's true. So who knows how fast the winds change on these things.
Yeah, but now that you brought up Velikovsky, lately, I remember, I think it was 3 years ago. Yeah, maybe a little less than that. I did a video with a Velikovsky advocate and on a follower of Velikovsky, and he has contact with the major electric universe scholars, and it was originally a live stream on Facebook, and I think I re-uploaded it to YouTube. Yeah. Now that you brought him up, what do you think about that theory, the electric universe?
I don't know that much about it. I've heard of a few things where he brings in the Bible and ancient Chinese materials and all that to say that it looks like the Red Sea, I'm sorry, the Nile turning red in Exodus was the result of Mars coming dangerously close to the Earth, and I guess just the reflection of the red planet in the water was the result of what? That strikes me as kooky. It's just not scientific methodology.
Yeah.
And some other
That's
crazy sounding things, but I have to admit, I don't know enough about it at all.
Yeah, well, one of the things that he claims, like Saturn being the first sun, that that's usually, I think he made that claim. Yeah. So,
and Jupiter was a comet or something.
he also claimed that Venus, the planet Venus, was ejected out of Jupiter or something like that.
Huh.
It was usually in. I might be mixing a few things up. I need to look into it more myself.
But it's that kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah. But that is weird.
I mean, you can say that. I mean, you can look at the Nebular Hypothesis of Kant, which I think is accepted today, that the planets are all balls of gas ejected by the sun, huge solar flares that were big enough that they had enough gravity to coalesce to a greater or lesser degree, like Mars, Earth, Venus are pretty solid, but the other ones, who knows? Boy, I've never understood that. Is there supposed to be a solid core to Saturn and Jupiter and so on? I don't even know. But if that's accepted, the basic nebular hypothesis, what he's saying is kind of a variation on that. Like, you wouldn't have to be insane to think this, but you'd need pretty good evidence for it. And I gather he kind of falls short in that department. I mean, he's not saying like a giant's playing with marbles and that's where the solar system came from. He is, it might be pseudoscience, but at least
that makes me bring up Leo Alatius there. His claim that the rings of Saturn is the foreskin of Jesus.
Oh my God. How on earth does he get that?
Like, well, if that's the case, I don't know. I'd love to know how big his wing was.
Yeah. Is this guy writing from a mental health facility or I mean, that's just gone. It
that was
like tough to type things out wearing a straitjacket, I imagine.
That was like 300 years ago when that was written, when that claim was made, but yeah.
Not only the size, but how many penises did he have? I mean,
yeah. I mean, that means his body must have been huge. How did the Romans?
Adam Kadmon, his body fills the universe.
How did the Romans crucify that? That's what I want to figure out. Through one massive cross.
Yeah. Oh man.
He'd definitely be reaching the sky.
Yeah. Yeah, they're making him into Purusha, or the heavenly Adam, who filled the universe. Jeez.
Yeah, the only thing is, it looks like he is really filling it.
Yeah, boy, that's a stunner. I know there are people that are trying to revive geocentrism and flat earthism. I hope they don't latch onto this next.
Oh yeah.
Ooh. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's regression right there. Definitely. Regression from progress. But that takes me to the next thing, because we've been leaning towards this. Like, we've been talking about this. You often point out that what could be crazy yesterday could be mainstream tomorrow. Do you think one day they'll finally that these academics they'll notice this trend and start thinking, maybe I should be more hesitant before I call somebody crazy?
I think so, because there's conceptuality that makes it more than a hope or a suspicion, like what Thomas Kuhn describes in the structure of scientific revolutions, with how and why paradigms change and grow in acceptance. That does, I think, really open the door for people, for scientists to say, it sure looks like so and so today, but we always try to debunk our own hypotheses to see how well they can pass the test. And if they don't, if there's some doubt, maybe in the future somebody will come up with it. They admit they don't know a lot of things, and hopefully eventually we'll get it. Well, that's pretty close to saying there could be another Copernican revolution somehow, like the multiverse thing, which is familiar to me from science fiction and comic books. Now people are taking that seriously. Well, that would be a gigantic paradigm shift. Because, as I say, it was only science fiction folks that thought it before, but now it's becoming more
Real.
Yeah, so anything could happen. In this case, though, with mythicism, I think there's a pretty good chance that will become the academic consensus, but simply because that happened with Moses and the other Old Testament characters within our lifetime, with Old Testament minimalism and people like Thomas L. Thompson. At first, people were saying, these guys are nuts. But the more evidence and debate there was, this became scholarly orthodoxy. Of course, fundamentalists don't buy it, but they have other reasons. It's because of their doctrines of inspiration and all that. Now, I think if mythicism becomes the consensus scholarly view, and it might well after a while, you're still going to have fundamentalists refusing to buy it. And that's true in many areas, like it's a cyclical thing. In the 18th century, universal salvation was Unitarians and Universalists. They championed that. There were a lot of them, but they were viewed as heretics and nuts and so forth. But they grew. Universalism by itself, forget the Unitarians, they became the 6th largest Protestant denomination, which is almost inconceivable now. But they worked themselves out of a job, because more and more people, Presbyterians, Methodists, etc., began to think, I think they got something there. Maybe Jesus did die for the sins of humanity, and it worked, because it wasn't that far out. And so, and that was why Universalism then shrank to nothing. There was no real need for a particular voice for that anymore.
That kind of.
And now it's happening again, because of course fundamentalists wouldn't accept that. But generations down the line, you have younger evangelical Christians saying, maybe universalism is true. And so there's new controversy. It all repeats itself, and you have it keeps getting thinned out. The heretics kind of come closer to being the mainstream, but then there's retrenchment by the traditionalists. And so I think that certainly would happen if mythicism became predominant in the academy, which may well happen.
It kind of takes me to Dr. Marcus Vincent. He is a mainstream scholar, and he has embraced 2nd century AD dating for the 4 Gospels, all 4 of them.
Good man.
Yeah, and that's in his I have his book right here. It's right next to me, so didn't have to go all the way out of the camera. Marcion and the Dating of the Synoptics.
I have it too. I'm ashamed to say I've not gotten around to reading it yet.
I think you should. Really. Let me see if I can find what that highlighted sentence I thought was super. He made a point. He made a point that It'd just be easier if I could find it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Go ahead.
Oh, I did.
Hey,
That was faster than I thought. It's on page 224. Indeed, the fact that the Gospels are not quoted or referred to in Paul or in other early Christian literature prior to Marcion speaks in favor of a dating of these texts to the time of Marcion. That's what he wrote there. Yet the evidence is clouded by the departmental boundaries between the disciplines of the New Testament studies and patristics. The well-known reference work, Biblia Patristica, for example, covers texts from the Origins to Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian in its first volume, but excludes all writings that can be found in the New Testament. If these were included, it would have been even more apparent that pages 223 and 415 of the first volume, listing over 10,000 quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the period, for the period from Marcion onwards, do not provide a single one for the time before Marcion. Walter Schmithels speaks of the missing resonance that our Gospels had far into the 2nd century. The first arguable cases are those authors who are sometimes dated to the beginning of the 2nd century: Ignatius, Papias, Polycarp, Hegesippus, but who, however, may be dated as contemporary with or even later than Marcion.
Yeah. Joseph Hoffman argues pretty cogently, to my mind, that Marcion must have been active some decades earlier than they like to place him, because, of course, they want to late date him. I think that's true. Schmidhals speaks of the virtually apocryphal character of the Gospels, that nobody knows them until later, and the same thing would imply. Well, though he doesn't say that about the Gospels, because the epistles, I'm sorry, and because he was hell bent on saying that they're actually Pauline.
When do you date the Marcion's Gospel, the Lord in this case?
That's tricky, because it's not absolutely clear what Marcion himself contributed and what his disciples attributed to him, which is why these days I tend to say the Marcionite Gospel. I'm not sure what the evidence is for saying that he himself did write it or compile it, but I would say it has to be 140 or 150. I think Mark's gospel has to be almost that early too, because of the various tree rings of postponing the parousia. There's several little break flows in Mark's gospel, adjustments. Now, all this is going to happen, but don't worry, the end is not coming yet, and so on and so on. But first, the gospel has to be preached to the whole wide world. How long is that going to take? And then finally, this generation won't pass away. But on the other hand, not even the Son knows the day or the hour. What? And then the transfiguration and so on. That's what he was talking about. It seems to me that it's like the Jehovah's Witnesses setting one date after another. They don't do that in 5 minutes. You have to have the thing fall through repeatedly, some years apart. And then you got Matthew. How long did it take him to get a hold of Mark? And Matthew has at least 3 strata to it. And so it just seems to me they got to all be in the 2nd century.
Yeah. There was something else I wanted to say, and I think I forgot. Oh, yeah, Nazareth. One of the things that you bring up in your books is that there was no 1st century Nazareth.
At least not in the first third of it. At least
Okay.
there's no attestation of it. René Salm wrote this couple of interesting books on that, and he goes through every stinking scrap of evidence, molecules of pottery and stuff, coins, and he says, now there's an awful lot of stuff that we can date from Nazareth, but not from that period. Some of it might come from there, but there's no identifying factor in it. And he says now it had been inhabited before, and in the middle of the first century, they began rebuilding it, and people started settling there. And so it's no surprise that by the time of the gospel writers, there was a Nazareth, and they figured Jesus the Nazarene implied he had been from Nazareth. But they were wrong, because there hadn't been a Nazareth then, and they didn't know that. I mean, there was in their day.
What do you think about the archaeology that's shown that they have found buildings that did date to that time, but it doesn't appear that it wasn't named Nazareth yet, even though there were small buildings that were found there?
Well, I don't know. The most recent thing I've read is the books by Rene Salmon, and there's no reference to that. How recent were these excavations?
Yeah, I remember reading an article. Apparently, it's a few years ago.
Because he was virtually omniscient in his scrutiny of archaeological finds and so forth, and he didn't mention it, but it may have been since he wrote these books.
Yeah, I'm tempted to think, and I do think that it's as he was saying, like it was settled earlier in the time of Jesus, but it wasn't. But I think it just wasn't called Nazareth until way later. It wasn't actually, the actual place did not receive its name. It seemed to be just another part of Galilee.
Well, I think what Rene argues is that there is a Nazareth plateau or something. Now, how long? And he says that was inhabited at this period for this length of time and all that. I don't know how far back that designation goes, though. I don't know if all the way back it had been known as the Nazareth Plateau. Maybe it's just what archaeologists dub it. So I'd need to ask him about that. That's a good question. Oh, by the way, somebody who there's an increasing partisanship for the idea that the Gospels do know well, that doesn't really change things. The Gospels do know the Pauline Epistles and are lifting stuff from them and attributing it to Jesus. David Oliver Smith argues that in great detail. I find myself stuck in that also with his arguments about chiastic structures. To make that work, he has to consider things parallels that seem to me pretty iffy, but some of them do seem to be pretty strong. So I cannot make up my mind on that. But I guess even if you said the epistles were known to the gospel writers, if the gospels are 2nd century, then that really doesn't make the epistles much earlier necessarily.
Yeah, I agree with that. Man, I think I thought it was standard to think the Gospels were of the epistles. I was under that impression. I'm not affected by it at all. As far as I'm concerned, as I've recently concluded, I view the epistles as largely, if not wholly, a construction during the reign of Bishop Pilate, when he was trying to weed out the Jerusalem Church of Circumcision from taking over Christianity.
That is really fascinating.
That's why, and I think he was simply imitating Saul, the guy that Josephus mentions a few times. Because the thing is, like I said before, the Saul and Josephus, I'm confident, is the one being referred to by Clement, the anonymous author of First Clement. Even though I do think, because of origin, that Clement did write it. Even if he didn't, it says he only wrote one letter, and he's ignorant on the whole New Testament practically. He's definitely, the Paul he's talking about definitely isn't Pilate. It makes no sense. Pilate is definitely, he's doing his thing in between Clement and Marcion. So it's just, I just don't see how that character in Clement could be the one that wrote the whole thing. It makes no sense. I think that Acts of the Apostles, one of the clearest divergences between the Paul and Acts and the Paul and the Epistles, is that Acts says that Paul fled from the Jews, like the flight from Damascus. It doesn't say from Damascus, but he says he was lowered down in the basket in Acts. But it places that event 30 years later. And Professor Eisman talks about this. I was like, oh, come on, really? He was lowered from the basket twice, 30 years apart. That's no way. I remember him saying that. It's like, you're right, Dr. Eisman, because Josephus says that Saul fled in Jewish wars. When Saul gets the hell out of Dodge with his brother Kosabaris, but his kinsman Antipas, not to be confused with Herod Antipas, apparently, he for some reason is staying in the palace, and he obviously gets whacked. But the brothers Saul and Kosabaris, they go to Achaia under the orders of Nero, which is interesting. And then the very next paragraph after that, Josephus says the Jews chase who they consider traitors in Damascus and kill them. I'm like, wait a minute, that's an odd sequence of events. To me, there's no way that story did not influence what the author of Acts wrote. In fact, I'm even convinced 2 Corinthians is aware of that situation. Because it's lowered from the basket. The only thing is, it places 30 years later under Aretas. And to me, I talked about this with Kenneth Humphreys when I interviewed him, and with James Valiant as well, and I think Brian Allen, that Paul, he's lowered from a basket on AD 37, and Herod and Aretas wants him dead. Now, the way I piece it, using Eisman's argument, what I do is I go to Romans 16, and I factor in, greetings, my kinsman Herodian. And in the previous verse, it says, greetings, Aristobulus, because Aristobulus is in the family of Herod. So that confirms he really means those people, because there are some people out there that, or somebody that might get mad at me because it's happened before and said, well, Herod is a common name. I'm like, well, Aristobulus and Herod together, is that a common situation? I love that. I love somebody to apologetically explain that to me. I don't think so. And Aretas chasing Paul in 2 Corinthians means on a basket. I'm sorry, that sounds like midrash to the book of Exodus, the nativity of Moses. Why would Aretas care to kill a baby? How does he know it? How does he know it's Paul? Like in Josephus, yes, Aretas gets mad that Herod Antipas divorced his daughter Phasaelus so he could go bang his niece Herodias. So I'm like, let's put that all together. 2 Corinthians is putting Paul in the context that he's a Herod, exactly as is Romans 16. That's why Aretas wants him dead, just like one of the Herods dead. The only problem is there's two basket scenarios. Josephus thinks that the Damascus flight happened in the 60s. I'm inclined to believe him more than the contradicting crap in the New Testament. And it's like, excuse me for sounding ridiculous. I know you don't think that I sound ridiculous. I'm talking about like other people. Like, a full-grown man is getting lowered from a basket to flee Aretas? I mean, it sounds too much like Moses.
I never thought of that. That is really fascinating.
He's placed on a basket so he could float on the river to escape the wrath of the Pharaoh. Seriously.
Yeah.
So I'm like, you see, the thing about Josephus is, in his storyline, he doesn't even have a basket appear in the story, which means the basket is an exaggeration in both accounts in the New Testament. That's midrash to Moses' nativity. in both cases.
Wow. Doesn't the Aretas thing also create some sort of havoc with the dating of John the Baptist?
I think it does, because Josephus says that John the Baptist died about AD 36. And I remember Eisman talking about that. Yeah, we got a problem here. It sounds like John died after Jesus. The Gospels flipped the matter. I think that's correct, assuming that there was a Jesus. And I still think that there was somebody. Rather, like, what I can do is, so I can phrase it in this way. One doesn't have to identify the Jesus mentioned by Tacitus and Josephus. I know you think the testimony was a total forgery, but I think the thing in Tacitus is definitely good. One doesn't have to claim that that really was the historical Jesus to still come under the impression of the evidence that somebody was killed by Pilate that was reinterpreted as the historical Jesus, at least by some people in the New Testament. That's, well, I guess, like Nicholas and Santa Claus all over again. He's not Santa, but
Well, it's very similar to the entirely plausible identification of the gospel Jesus with Jesus ben Ananias. It obviously implies that somebody couldn't keep the dating straight, but it would have been almost irresistible to confuse these two guys. So what you're saying, especially since the crucifixion account in Matthew actually has Jesus Barabbas and Jesus of Nazareth, it almost invites confusion between these characters.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you just gave me an idea there. And you might have been thinking this. You might have been thinking this already when you said that. I'm not sure. But I think Jesus Barabbas, but his story is ridiculous, obviously not historical. There were two Jesuses appearing before Pilate, both sons of God or the Father. Release the terrorists, kill the pacifists, no way.
Yeah, that seems crazy. It wouldn't seem that stupid, except that Pilate is shown being intimidated by people who threaten to rat on him to the Roman authorities. If that's the case, he's not getting anywhere by releasing a known anti-Roman terrorist. It's like they forgot what they said a minute before.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. I think Jesus Barabbas, in a way, proves my point, though. They created this distraction from reality that the Pauline Jesus was being interpreted as this rebel. And to weed that out, they created this fictional character who gets released. Says, oh, forget about the rebel attributes. He just ran away. We let him go. Nothing to see here. He's gone.
Yeah, I think Chaim Maccabee believed that, it was a variation on the Barabbas thing, that the Jewish crowd were actually demanding Pilate release Jesus of Nazareth, that they weren't shaking their fists and wanting that Jesus dead. I forget where he went with that again, though, but he kind of flipped it around. But alternately, you can say, well, this is a kind of a Docetist thing, that the real Jesus, the Son of God, son of Bar Abbas, son of the Father, he avoided the crucifixion. It was this Jesus called Christ, though he wasn't. I have to admit that I find that sort of attractive, but again, it's just a range of interest. It's like a smorgasbord of fascinating possibilities. Did I mention to you the Sacred Executioner by Chaim Maccabee?
I don't think you did.
If you can get a hold of that, and I tried for years and finally got a copy, it is really eye-opening stuff. It kind of fits in very well with Rene Girard and the scapegoat business. I have a chapter on Girard's thing in my deconstruction of Jesus, where I think he kind of goes off the track, but it works real well with Maccabee's Sacred Executioner, suggesting what led to the formation of the stories and so on. But I think you would really love it if you could get a hold of it. Maybe it's available these days. I haven't had to look.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense to me. Yeah, that's what I tend to think is going on here. That what I'm saying, I think works both of historicism and mythicism. And I have a feeling that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're leaning towards something like that somewhat, especially with what your previous comments with SGF Brandon on SGF Brandon and Eisenman. But I'm going to put it in a different way. The Christians recognized, at the very least, there was somebody that could be interpreted that's very similar to their Jesus enough to be the historical Jesus. He was a rebel that was crucified by Pilate. And even if it wasn't really Jesus, but it was somebody else, it was similar enough that they had to create the Barabbas story to get that out, to remove that situation from the New Testament. That's what that sounds like to me. That would fit in within the definition of anchorism instead of historicist. And that's what creates the situation that this took place during the reign of Pilate. And that would actually explain, that would be an interesting way of explaining why in the earlier material, the story was not set in Pilate's time at all, or any time period, really.
Yeah, if they're looking around, if they're different attempts to historicize Jesus, I mean, it looks that way to me. If you compare the Claudius date with Irenaeus and the Jesus ben Perichiah thing that Mead talks about from the Talmud, it kind of implies to me that people didn't have a decent idea of when Jesus had lived or died, because he hadn't. And it's like when Herodotus is trying to place the historical Hercules on the timeline. And he says, well, this detail of the story would imply he lived in the reign of this king, but that detail would imply a later one. Who knows? And he sort of just gives up. But that strikes me as very likely what happened with Jesus. And I'm becoming aware that similar ambiguities exist with the Buddha and Muhammad. I have a book, When Did Buddha Live? And it goes through, it's a bunch of papers about different theories, or Zoroaster for a long time.
Well, the thing is, this would seem to fit with Dr. Margaret Barker's argument. If Jesus was a theophany of Yahweh, but at some point, to add to that, he was conflated with a historical figure that died during the reign of Pilate. That would explain why. That would explain, if it is true that he started out as mythical, but became historical, that there was an anchor in the 10-year reign of Pontius Pilate that created that situation.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, that when you say this guy was the Messiah, you meant this guy was Jesus the Messiah, the latest theophany of Jehovah. Though that kind of gets into the Jesus as channeler thing. That there was a historical Jesus, but the teacher Jesus was the Christ Spirit speaking through him, though it doesn't necessarily commit you to saying that throughout Jesus' career he was already bearing the spirit of Jehovah or something. Oof, boy, I'm getting a headache. all this unaccustomed.
I
thinking.
still, because of an anchor, I'm undecided if I'm just going to stick with calling myself anchorist, or if that still is somewhat qualified as historicist. But it sounds more like anchorism to me, because what I'm saying is based on the development of the text, there was a confusion, and I think this could have happened even as early as Paul, because if you take out the suspected interpolations, there are still parts of what Paul says that insinuate Jesus was a man at some point.
And you do have that weird language about some preaching another Jesus. What is going on?
Oh, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, yeah. You preach on you follow Apollos, Cephas, John, or Jesus.
I am of Christ. But later on, he says something, I think in 2 Corinthians, if somebody, or is it Galatians, they're two similar passages, you follow those, put up with those who preach another Jesus, a different gospel, a different spirit. I'd love to know what that means. Does he mean another character named Jesus? There were plenty of them we know of. I begin to wonder if they decided to get together and say, well, they're the same Jesus, just like when Christians and Jews and Muslims realize, hey, we're talking about the same God. It's all the God of the Old Testament that we share. What do you know? Because there's still some people who say, oh, no, Allah is not the biblical God, but he obviously is. And it might be that they said, oh, you got a Jesus, we got one too. Maybe they're the same guy. Burton Mack implies something like that when he says there were these different Jesus movements and Christ cults that came together somehow. And that sounds ridiculous until you think, wait a minute, Paul refers to another Jesus.
There we go. Yep.
It's open season then.
It certainly is.
Oh, man. Wow. Sheesh.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.